Marx also diagnoses alienation from the intermediaries of money, state, commodities, and God. Money alienates us from the good and value in this world. It seems to be self-sufficient and is the arbiter of all value. It alienates us because we are forced to see the world and affirm the good, as well as observe ourselves, anything that is valuable through this intermediary. So all personal value, all spiritual value becomes an intermediary through currency, through money, uh, marriage, religion. I mean, what's going to church or synagogue or uh, so mosque anymore? You know, you pay the institution for funds, and that's not necessarily because it wants to. There are plenty of religious institutions on the left that just get totally silenced. There is a Christian left in Europe that totally gets knocked out of American conversation and politics, and people here think that Christianity automatically means you're on the right. That's not necessarily true. But when it comes to the evangelical sector in America, they've taken on this prosperity gospel that's very popular amongst the right, that people who are rich are endowed by God with success and wealth and a good life, and that those who are poor are in that situation because of themselves or their own choices, their own moral failings. And this prosperity gospel really pushes a lot of the deregulation that you see in Republican legislators. A lot of, let's get rid of welfare programs. Let's get rid of a safety net at all. God is alienating because we are affirmed only through him as an intermediary. We project onto him our best qualities, separating us from them, and pay attention to God instead of the real world. So basically, God is all perfect, so why even pay attention to the world? Because the world is imperfect. It's not what you want it to be. The state is alienating because we are forced to act through the state. Our will is no longer expressed by us through an intermediary. So back then, Germany was still a monarchy, and a big part of monarchy is it coinciding with religion. Under a monarchy, the monarch is basically chosen by God or is an agent of God. And that's what Marx was dealing with in Germany in the 1840s, a German society that viewed their monarch as a god. And Marx is trying to go against that entirely. And for that, he ended up in prison. Marx got imprisoned several times for speaking out against the state, speaking out against the monarchy. But it was the type of speech that was needed for change. Commodities are alienating because they are the only representations of social relationship within production. We are forced to see all forms of social relations through the exchange of commodities. So I feel like for a lot of people, the only interaction they get anymore is when they buy something, talking to a car dealer, going to the store, buying groceries. I mean, not for everyone, but for a large enough percentage of the population that there's a huge sense of disconnection from the greater community. And there really isn't meant to be a greater community. That's not what the bourgeois state wants. That would be anti-liberal. If the entire society was truly one connected community, you would eliminate the need for capitalism. You would have communism simply through cooperation, as Kropotkin would put it. This is interesting because it relates directly to us. Only in North American states, at least in some of them, does the Jewish question lose its and this is a quote from the Jewish question, lose its theological significance and become a really secular question. Only where the political state exists in its completely developed form can the relation of the Jew and of the religious man in general to the political state, and therefore the relation of religion to the state, show itself in its specific character, in its purity. The criticism of this relation ceases to be theological criticism as soon as the state ceases to adopt a theological attitude toward religion, as soon as it behaves towards religion as a state, i.e. politically. Criticism then becomes criticism of the political state. At this point, where the question ceases to be theological, Bauer's criticism ceases to be critical. Now, Bauer is the person Marx is responding to when he's writing the Jewish question. Bauer was the one who wrote the anti-Semitic version of this essay. Marx responds, and says that, no, we're going to reconsider. At that point, Jews were not, unlike now with the alt-right, Jews really were not viewed in a racial way. And I mean, European Jews, even Sephardic Jews, which means they're from the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, or Spain, were viewed as just white. There were white Jewish slave owners in the South. Judah Benjamin was a senator from South Carolina. He was Jewish and he was pro-slavery, pro-Confederacy. So there really was not much political anti-Semitism in North America up until pretty recently, up until post-Holocaust. It really has been a reaction by the American right. Although I'd like to note that in the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant forced Jews off their land in Tennessee, Georgia, and Kentucky in a ruling. I forget what it was called. You can look it up later. Just look up U.S. Grant Jewish eviction or something like that, and you'll get to it. So America has a very complicated history, but at that point in the 19th century, America was seen as pretty mild to Jews compared to what was being faced in Europe, and now it's kind of flipped. Aside from the purely pro-Zionist stance that the right takes in America, and that doesn't have anything to do with religious or racial tolerance. That has to do with wanting to get rid of the Palestinians for apocalyptic religious reasons, and that's why their agenda needs to be totally eliminated, because there's no way we can actually follow through with the far right agenda and have a world at all. So Marx goes on to say, in the United States, there is neither a state religion nor a religion declared to be of the majority, nor the predominance of one cult over another. The state stands aloof from all cults. Now, I don't really know how that phrase plays anymore after the Trump era, but he gets at what the founding fathers really wanted. They didn't want political parties. They didn't want factions. They wanted truly individual thinkers. And if people were responsible and intelligent enough on average to take on that responsibility, then maybe liberalism could work. But I don't think people will be individually motivated enough without something bigger to live for and fight for. Indeed, there are some North American states where the Constitution does not impose any religious belief or religious practice as a condition of political rights. Thankfully, that's still true in some American states. Nevertheless, in the United States, people do not believe that a man without religion can be an honest man. That definitely still holds true. Hegelians, this goes to German philosophy in the 19th century. Hegel believed that we create God by projecting all the best parts of our species being, human nature, onto him and none of our deficiencies. He thinks this is alienating for three reasons. We necessarily must distance ourselves from our best qualities, since that is now in the realm of God. We say something like complete non-reciprocation that can only be done by Jesus. And this we are alienated from the best parts of our nature. So again, God taking over agency and power. Christianity gives, I don't know why it does that. That was a long one anyway. I'll just switch to the next one. Critique of political emancipation and liberalism. The question to be addressed whether Jews should be given special rights and privileges in Prussia, which is really the main point of the Jewish question, talking about Jews specifically in Germany in the 19th century. Brouwer, another Hegelian, responds that instead of presenting the Jew with extra rights, the state should just not be religious. He argues for political emancipation by getting rid of the Christian state. In other words, Brouwer is a liberal who believes that everyone should be granted rights to practice and not be discriminated upon by their religion. Political emancipation ensures that people won't be discriminated by the state on certain matters. But Marx points to America, where religion is as burgeoning as ever despite being a non-religious state. That turns out to be very prescient. Marx concludes that political emancipation must not be enough to truly free man. Political emancipation is problematic for a few reasons. The state is just as oppressive and as alienating as religion. It is an intermediary through which the citizen acts, and in this way it creates the exact same issues of alienation and oppression that Feuerbach sees in Christianity. Quote, by emancipating himself politically, man emancipates himself in a devious way through an intermediary, however necessary this intermediary may be. Finally, even when he proclaims himself an atheist through the intermediary of the state, that is, when he declares the state to be an atheist, he is still engrossed in religion because he only recognizes himself as an atheist in a roundabout way, though through an intermediary. Religion is simply the recognition of man in a roundabout fashion, that is, through an intermediary. The state is the intermediary between man and human liberty, just as Christ is the intermediary to whom man attributes all his own divinity and all his religious bonds. So the state is the intermediary to which man confides all his non-divinity and all his human freedom. So, in so many words, basically, Christianity comes to control the state, and the state comes to control man. That's about, I have about 20 slides, so that's about a quarter of it. Any questions up to this point? Oh, okay. Emancipation. Emancipation on the political level is not enough to bring true human emancipation. To be politically emancipated from religion is not to be finally and completely emancipated from religion, because political emancipation is not the final and absolute form of human emancipation. The limits of political emancipation appear at once in the fact that the state can liberate itself from a constraint without man himself being really liberated, that a state may be a free state without man himself being a free man. Political emancipation requires the erection of individual rights. These individual rights, far from dispelling what is dangerous from society, recognizes them through their own political disavowal. It institutionalizes materialism and egoism. Marx recognizes the contribution of political emancipation. It brought down an oppressive society where everything was political, and that the Lord dictated the production life and relationships of the serf in nature. The conception of rights brought down through feudalism was practiced, but these exact same political bonds, which were oppressive, also restrained the egoistic spirit of civil society. More from Marx on Christianity. Christianity gives a person a peculiar sense of his own dignity and importance. This commonly leads to egoism and narcissism, but that is not the main critique. The main critique is that believers do not possess dignity in themselves, but only acquire it mediated through a deity, just as a servant sometimes identifies himself with the social class of the employer. In that way, we are alienated from our own dignity and authority. Hegel's definition of an unhappy consciousness is one that is separated within itself, disposing part of its essence into a beyond. This helps us understand Marx's disdain of Christianity. He thinks this is alienating for three reasons. We necessarily must distance ourselves from our best qualities, since that is now in the realm of God. We say something like complete non-reciprocation, that we can only be done by Jesus. And in this, we are alienated from the best parts of our nature. We venerate God. We must necessarily spend less attention with other humans and even ourselves. And in the process, we become alienated from our species being and companions. And again, he's referring to Christ, but you could use this for any religion, any major religious figure, and replace it in. He's simply using Christianity because he's in Germany. And that should be obvious that in Europe, Christianity controlled the state up until within the last century, basically. Christianity gives a person a peculiar sense of his own dignity and importance. This commonly, oh, that was a repeat, never mind. Hegel's definition of an unhappy consciousness is one that is separated within itself, disposing part of its essence into a beyond. This helps us understand Marx's disdain of Christianity. When it comes to human emancipation, Marx never gives a full definition of human emancipation, but it will necessarily entail non-alienation. Non-alienation from the species being, that is, to exercise his full humanhood and capacities. Non-alienation from his social being, that is, that That is, he is no longer exercising his social power through the intermediary of the state. Marx asks, what does the first criteria mean that individual man is absorbed into the abstract citizen? The answer, we are not going to relate to one another exclusively as an abstract citizen with rights and contracts, but most of our relationships with others will be forms of familial relationships, much broader than a nuclear family. Human emancipation will only be complete when the real individual man is absorbed into himself, the abstract citizen, when as an individual man in his everyday life, in his work, and in his relationships, he has become a species being. And when he has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers so that he no longer separates his social power from himself as a political power. Marx, in another place, expressed the unlikely idea that as you figure out the economic relations within a society, the political relations will resolve themselves. Now Marx brings up historical materialism in this work. A great example of Marx's historical materialism is how he views religion as a function of secular societal problems. Religion no longer appears as the basis, but as the manifestation of secular narrowness. That is why we explain the religious constraints upon the free citizens by the secular constraints upon them. We do not claim that they must transcend their religious narrowness in order to get rid of their secular limitations. We claim that they will transcend their religious narrowness once they have overcome their secular limitations. We do not turn secular questions into theological questions. We turn theological questions into secular ones. History has for long enough been resolved into superstition, but we now resolve superstition into this story. The question of the relation between political emancipation and religion becomes for us a question of the relation between political emancipation and human emancipation. We criticize the religious feelings of the political state by criticizing the political state in its secular form, disregarding its religious failings. Marx goes on to the deification of money, which really we all know of. A reason why Marx thinks political emancipation is not enough for anyone, but especially the Jews, because he sees Judaism, at least its pragmatic manifestations, as greedy. And this is where it kind of gets controversial, and a lot of people do accuse Marx of anti-Semitism. He himself was at least part Jewish, and he kind of hid that a lot. He was conflicted about it, to say the least. Not that he was anti-Semitic at all, but he simply saw problems with the culture and decided that he was going to levy criticism against it. I don't know if that really helped long term, considering some of the things that ended up happening. But he goes on to question, what is the profane basis of Judaism? Practical needs, self-interest. And again, these are Marx's words. These are not my words. What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. In the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. Now here, this is where certain people will twist that. What he really means is the Jewish people themselves have been tricked by capitalism into choosing a life in the financial sector instead of something that is more intellectual rather than just a means to an end. And at that point, he knew that in Europe, some of the only jobs that Jews were allowed to have were in the financial sector. They weren't allowed to work regular labor jobs or be in political leadership. So he knows that it's part of the culture, that it's led to horrible stereotypes and horrible assumptions about Jews, but they're based in a reality that did exist, that in medieval Europe, Jews were resigned to only working in banks or the financial sector. And some might say, well, that's a good thing, but we all know that that really is not a good thing. That's obviously not good for a culture, not good for an individual. This is not an isolated instance. The Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, not only by acquiring the power of money, but also because money has become, through him and also a part of him, a world power, while the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. Marx is here. I'm not even sure if I completely agree with that. He's sort of giving a entryway for future anti-Semites in the 20th century to bring up conspiracies of global Jewish communism or global Jewish capitalism, even, which really makes no sense. I mean, how can you be responsible for both? It's one of the things Marx probably should have addressed further. And this work on the Jewish question was only about 43 pages. So compared to some of his other works, compared to the 3,000 page Capital he wrote, he really didn't go that deep into this discussion. So some of these quotes, he doesn't really explain as much as he should have. So just take that into consideration when you hear that, or when you read that Marx himself was not perfect and he had his own biases. But parsing through the shameless anti-Semitism, Marx presents a critique of money that is insightful. Money is the jealous god of Israel, beside which no other god may exist. Money abases all the gods of mankind and changes them into commodities. Money is the universal and self-sufficient value of all things. It has, therefore, deprived the whole world, both the human world and nature, of their own proper value. Money is the alienated essence of man's work and existence. Their essence dominates him and he worships it. Every creature should be transformed into property, the fishes in the water, the birds of the air, the plants of the earth. Objectification is the practice of alienation. Just as man, so long as he is engrossing in religion, can only objectify his essence by an alien and fantastic being, so under the sway of egoistic need, he can only affirm himself and produce objects in practice by subordinating his products and his own activity to the domination of an alien entity, and by attributing to them the significance of an alien entity, namely money. So Marx sees money as something not even earthly, not even human, something that is purely soulless and not even something that exists in reality. It's all just like Matt McConaughey says in Wolf of Wall Street. It's fugazi. It's an idea. It's a pyramid scheme that's created by the elites. That's all capitalism is, really. It's a pyramid scheme. It's a giant pyramid scheme. Slaves to the dollar. His critique of money is that it seems to be self-sufficient. That is to say, it contains a universal judge of value and it doesn't need anything else to impart its value. Of course, this is an illusion. Just like commodity fetishization, we impart money with its value as a social convention. Relating to another religion, Buddhism again provides a solution to this Western problem by seeing the conventional nature of reality. If the problem really is that we are reifying commodities and money, and that is in some parts alienating, then seeing them through the lens of dependent origination would help us realize we ultimately impart it, and money is not self-sufficient. So just another example of how Eastern and Western ideology clearly, I mean, just look at the history of the Cold War and the result of the Cold War, and how today, out of the 5 remaining Marxist-Leninist nations, most of them are in the East. The East definitely has a more communitarian view of the world and a less individualistic view of the world, whether it's the Buddhist view or the Confucian view or the secular Chinese view. Because we believe money to be self-sufficient, it becomes the judge and arbiter of all value. We start seeing everything through the lens of money. It becomes the intermediary through which we see things like God and the state. What we mean by objectification is the evaluation of an object or person based on one metric, in this sense, money. So someone's net worth, literally their net worth. This objectification alienates because our first order interaction is no longer with the object, but its monetary value. So advancing beyond religion, the religious spirit cannot be really secularized, for what is it in itself, but the non-secular form of a stage in the development of the human mind. The religious spirit can only be secularized insofar as the stage of development of the human mind of which it is the religious expression makes its appearance and becomes constituted in its secular form. This takes place in the democratic state. Not Christianity, but the human basis of Christianity is the basis of the state. Religion remains the ideal, non-secular consciousness of its members, because religion is the ideal form of the stage of human development achieved in this state. Now, Marx is saying that in terms of what the modern ideology is. So in the 1840s, Christianity is viewed sort of as a perfect ideology, a perfect way of governing. It's really, like Marx mentions before, only in North America where it's still valued for someone to be religious, but the state itself is not religious. So in Europe, at this time, religion and the state are still completely intertwined. Democracy and religion. In the perfect democracy, the religious and theological consciousness itself is in its own eyes the more religious and the more theological, because it is apparently without political significance, without worldly aims, the concern of a disposition that shuns the world, the expression of intellectual narrow-mindedness, the product of arbitrariness and fantasy, and because it is a life that is really of the other world. Christianity attains here the practical expression of its universal religious significance in that the most diverse world outlooks are grouped alongside one another in the form of Christianity, and still more because it does not require other people to profess Christianity, but only religion in general, any kind of religion. The religious consciousness revels in the wealth of religious contradictions and religious diversity. We have thus shown that political emancipation from religion leaves religion in existence, although not a privileged religion. The contradiction in which the adherent of a particular religion finds himself involved in relation to citizenship is only one aspect of the universal secular contradiction between the political state and civil society. The consummation of the Christian state is the state which acknowledges itself as a state and disregards the religion of its members. The emancipation of the state from religion is not the emancipation of the real man from religion. So just because the state is secular doesn't mean that the individual necessarily has a path to become secular. Marx analyzes feudalism, which at the time was essentially still practiced, at least in Russia. Political emancipation is at the same time the dissolution of the old society on which the state alienated from the people the sovereign power is based. What was the character of the old society? It can be described in one word: feudalism. The character of the old society was directly political. That is to say, the elements of civil life, for example, property or the family or the mode of labor, were raised to the level of elements of political life in the form of seignory, estates, and corporations. In this form, they determined the relations of the individual to the state as a whole, i.e. his political relation, that is, his relation of separation and exclusion from the other components of society. For that organization of national life did not raise property or labor to the level of social elements. On the contrary, it completed their separation from the state as a whole and constituted them as discrete societies within societies. Thus, the vital functions and conditions of life and of civil society remained, nevertheless, political, although political in the feudal sense. That is to say, they secluded the individual from the state as a whole, and they converted the particular relation of this corporation to the state as a whole into his general relation to the life of the nation, just as they converted his particular civil activity and situation into his general activity and situation. As a result of this organization, the unity of the state and also the consciousness, will, and activity of this unity, the general power of the state, are likewise bound to appear as the particular affair of a ruler and of his servants, isolated from the people. It's basically the king, the church, and no one else. That's basically the rule in feudalism. So many words. Feudal society was resolved into its basic element, man, but man as he really formed its basis, egoistic man. So every man for himself, basically. Individual lords, individual kingships controlled small plots of land and fought against each other. That was basically the history of medieval Europe. This man, the member of civil society, is thus the basis, the precondition of the political state. He is recognized as such by this state in the rights of man. The liberty of egoistic man and the recognition of this liberty, however, is rather the recognition of the unrestrained movement of the spiritual and material elements which form the contents of his life. Hence, man was not freed from religion, he received religious freedom. He was not freed from property, he received freedom to own property. He was not freed from the egoism of business, he received freedom to engage in business. Now Marx brings up some former philosophers. Therefore, Rousseau correctly described the abstract idea of political man as follows. Whoever dares undertake to establish a people's institution must feel himself capable of changing, as it were, human nature, of transforming each individual, who by himself is a complete and solitary whole, into a part of a larger whole, from which, in a sense, the individual receives his life and his being, of substituting a limited and mental existence for the physical and the independent existence. He has to take from man his own powers and give him in exchange alien powers which he cannot employ without the help of other men. All emancipation is a reduction of the human world and relationship to man himself. Political emancipation is the reduction of man on the one hand, to a member of civil society, to an egoistic, independent individual, and on the other hand, to a citizen, a juridical person. Only when the real individual man reabsorbs in himself the abstract citizen, and as an individual human being has become a species being in his own everyday life, in his practical work, and in his particular situation, only when man has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers, and consequently no longer separates social power from himself in the shape of political power, only then will human emancipation have been accomplished. The establishment of the political state and the dissolution of civil society into independent individuals whose relation with one another depend on law, just as the relations of men in the system of estates and guilds depends on privilege, is accomplished by one and the same act. Man as a member of civil society, unpolitical man, inevitably appears, however, as the natural man. The rights of man appear as natural rights, because conscious activity is concentrated on the political act. Egoistic man is the passive result of the dissolved society, a result that is simply found in existence, an object of immediate certainty, therefore a natural object. The political revolution resolves civil life into its component parts without revolutionizing these component parts themselves or subjecting them to criticism. It regards civil society, the world of needs, labor, private interests, civil law, as the basis of its existence, as a precondition not requiring further substantiation, and therefore as its natural basis. Finally, man as a member of civil society is held to be man in the proper sense, as distinct from, I'm not sure exactly what that is, because he is man in his sensuous, individual, immediate existence, whereas political man is only abstract, artificial man as an allegorical, juridical person. The real man is recognized only in the shape of the egoistic individual. The true man is recognized only in the shape of the abstract citizen. So that's very abstract to me, what Marx wrote, and it's open to interpretation. And my last couple of slides are really just about contemporary, what I already mentioned, that, you know, the QAnon conspiracy and the fact that it plays such a big role in Trumpism means that going back in time and looking at political and historical views of not just Jews, but other religious and ethnic minorities, especially in Europe in the last couple of centuries as fascism has developed, understanding why are certain groups targeted, how are they used by the ruling class as targets for the lower the lower classes of the predominant ethnic group. That's what we see in fascism. The lower classes, the lower middle class, even the middle class of the predominant ethnic group is turned against religious, ethnic, or sexual minorities, and they're mobilized in a frenzy that results in something like January 6th of last year. These people, what Marx is talking about here with the state and religion being combined is a big component of Trumpism, combining religion, Christianity, as in here, with his personal rule as a monarch. Trumpism is basically a neo-monarchy. He wants to rule with his children forever, which is why he needs to be defeated permanently. His campaign, his movement, his ideology. I have Italian family as well that grew up in fascist Italy under Mussolini, and they said it was hell. They said that it was scary and that you were afraid of the police stealing your stuff flat out or killing you if you were out of line in any way or you didn't support the fascists in any way. This is a legitimate threat, and maybe before Trump, I said things like that and it sounded like hyperbole, but I lived in the most right-wing part of America for a long time, enough to know that these people are willing to take drastic action to what they think is save their country, which really means just create a theocratic ethno-state that's a fascist organization. The Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, these people are armed and they target people like Jews. That's a big part of our mission as communists is to fight these vicious forces that want to hurt people just because they're an easy target. I think that should be one of the ultimate missions of what we do.